It is my privilege to have Eno with me today. Really excited to talk to you. Maybe just to get started, give us a picture. What is Factory for those in the audience who maybe don't know it?
Yeah, totally. So Factory, we focus on basically helping primarily Global 2000 businesses build out what we say is like a fully autonomous product engineering system. So we sort of have three different components to that. The first is a model-agnostic software development agent that we call Droid, which that may be like the sort of name you've heard about us. And then we provide two other things, an agent readiness platform and an agent effectiveness platform that basically says, how ready for these systems is your code base, is your engineering system? How do you measure like what level of autonomy your organization's at? And then in terms of effectiveness, how do you know that these things are actually doing their job properly? And then we help businesses basically like roll that out in a reasonable fashion at scale.
This is a fairly competitive space. There are great AI coding tools, whether it's Codex or it's Claude and some others that you probably compete with. For those who maybe haven't used Factory, can you give us the pitch? Like, why should someone switch from a Claude code to using Factory?
Yeah, totally. And I think we take like the organizational view here of, I think that for an individual software development agent, you can actually probably get a lot of similar value, even with a harness that's like pretty meaningfully different or worse or better. There are a couple of factors though that I think a business needs to think about. The first is risk and like what does it mean to basically rely on one model provider for your entire software development lifecycle, right? If that model provider only has like 1.9 of reliability, you're almost guaranteed to have an incident, a sev while that model's down, right? So optionality in being model agnostic is a huge advantage to larger businesses. The second is that I think that there's actually this like sort of almost like refinement that happens from needing to optimize for different models. Like one of our products is called Missions, and inside of that, the best performance comes from blending like Opus 4.6 as the executor, GPT 5.4 as the validator, and I think increasingly we're seeing speciation in the models where certain models are good at certain capabilities, and being able to blend all that together gives you a huge advantage on very hard problems.
So that's a perfect segue. I wanted to ask you about Missions. Super exciting release. Tell us, what is Missions?
Yeah, and I guess I sort of alluded to it. Basically, we released a feature that lets the agent, Droid, solve very large-scale problems over very long periods of time. So let's say that you wanted to build something, like do a modernization or a migration. Typically, you would probably run hundreds of sessions with an agent to do that. You would sort of say, I want to do this, I want to do that. You'll have to come up with basically the task decomposition of what needs to go into that migration. And with Missions, it sort of handles the entire task decomposition phase, brings like potentially even hundreds of sort of like feature level items, and can run for, I think the largest mission in production that we ran was 16 days straight of continuous effort from the agent, basically migrating almost 1 million lines of code. And so it's very focused also on validation and like making sure that the output is correct.
That's crazy. Like, how do you think about what kinds of work are good? Like, you gave an example of like migrations, but maybe I guess the question I'm trying to ask you is like, as a developer, how do I think about like I'm doing some piece of work? How do I think about when to use Missions versus using a typical Droid session?
Yeah, and I think that we're generally thinking about how to allow the developer to preserve the most control while also increasing the scope and scale of what they're able to delegate. And so in this case, like it feels like the primitive of like an individual agent session is good for the type of work that an agent can do in like, let's say 20 to 30-ish minutes, which means it can write a pretty solid plan, probably change like anywhere from 10 to 30, maybe even 50 files. But ultimately, the sort of like issue with an individual session that's unconstrained from the broader set of work is you as a developer have to almost like tell the agent, this is how you should validate the correctness. This is where this is in the context of the broader set of work I'm doing. And so the moment that you start to cross the threshold of, oh, I may have to work for, like I'm sort of doing this task that relies on multiple pieces falling into place together. The context is very broad. It might take me you know, maybe even like weeks to do this level of task, that's when I think the mission as like a very almost like goal-directed task chunk becomes reasonable. So maybe very practically, if you think it's gonna take the agent more than like an hour to do, you should move to a mission and you'll get a much more accurate answer.
I'm gonna give you a framing. I may be wrong, that's fine. Is it fair to say that like missions are great for work that is hard to fully specify? What is the link between how well you can specify work versus like how you decide which mode of agent you use?
I would say that missions are best for work that can be validated very well. And so validation here means when it passes, like if you're building a web app, validation might mean having the agent actually control the browser and click through and confirm that the change that you had actually works. It might be, if it's an API, running really high quality and a very wide set of end-to-end tests, checking different performance, mutations. And so the more that your work is validatable, the better missions are, because basically the sort of underlying implementation is seek task decomposition, take the task, break it into as many parts as possible, and then for each of those parts, figure out exactly how the AI system should validate that individual part. And then as you start to do all of that work, start to validate larger and larger chunks of that work. And you basically keep doing that until it's correct.
In the launch post, you talked about how you were using missions also for some non-technical work or non-coding work. Can you give us some highlights of where missions shine for non-coding work?
Yeah, and generally, like we sort of have this hypothesis that the best general agents are probably just software development agents under the hood.
Yeah.
And I think that that's probably, like the model labs, like Cowork, for example, is branded as a general agent, but it's just Claude code, like wrapped with like nicer UI. And I think that we see similar things of a lot of our customers use Droid to do things like write blog posts, generate images, like via other tools. One of the more interesting pieces that we found is we gave it to a lab that was building protein folding, like deep learning algorithms. And actually, Andrej Karpathy also just released something called research agent or AI research. And it's a very similar concept of a mission can be specified like, here is a set of like basically training or machine learning or ML objectives. Here's the score we want you to get on that. Just try a bunch of things until it works, right? And a mission will just keep going and keep going and keep going. So I think that it sort of definitely touches the edges of software development, like ML, writing papers, scientific work. But ultimately, if it has some form of validation, that's where missions are like best.
That's so cool. From an infrastructure perspective, what kinds of challenges did you have to solve in order to make missions happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, the primary one is like these things run for a long time, and you close your laptop. And so sandboxes are like a huge priority for making sure that these missions can run properly, that they can run the whole time, that they have all the sort of like, and when you actually run these things, you realize how often developers have all these nice to haves like auth and permissions, and even something as simple as like a rogue CAPTCHA can really mess with your experience of validating and sort of doing the work that you need. And so figuring out how do we get a sandbox and how do we get a cloud experience that allows you to run agents for effectively days continuously. That's actually, surprisingly, almost no sandboxes can run for more than like 24 hours because people just assumed the unit of work was smaller.
I can think of one.
Yeah, I can as well.
That's a natural shift for us to talk about sandboxes. I think you have alluded to this a little bit, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Talk a little bit about some of the design patterns that you found that are, I would call them sandbox native.
Yeah, totally. There are a bunch of different ways that I think sandboxes have only just begun to be truly explored as a design pattern for agents. There are certain primitives that I think were very early, and now they're starting to feel a lot more baked, like forking, where you take the sandbox state and you say, I want to, let's say that the agent has like two different sub-agents that want to execute in parallel, right? normally, if you're on a computer, those agents, you sort of actually have to think about, how do I coordinate? One agent might need to take the work first, and then the other agent takes it after. Maybe I run them in 2 work trees, and I clone a work tree and send one agent off here or another. Forking gives you one extra option of saying, well, I have some state of my sandbox, and I want to run 2 separate actions, and then I want to merge them or bring them back together, right? So forking enables that. It also just enables checkpoints, being able to say, like, okay, let's save the exact state, not just of the files, because Git gives you that, but of really everything in memory. And so I think that those are like super interesting and very underexplored in the design space of coding agents. And then there's a lot that goes into the economics, actually, of, let's say I do want an agent to run for like 48 hours straight. Are we going to be, and assuming like a SaaS model, like, are we going to be charged based off of compute, active CPU, non-active CPU? There's ways to take advantage of that when you are potentially running like hundreds of thousands of these sandboxes. You actually need to think about what's the right economic model for charging the end user or, you know, for the provider.
What is your take on the future of sandboxes? Like, if you were, you know, theoretically to run product at, you know, any of the sandbox companies, like, what are the main capabilities that you wish that the sandboxes were capable of supporting? Yeah, I'd be curious sort of what your perspective is here.
For us, well, self-hosted is a huge one. Being able to like manage and host this runtime, like on-prem deployments make up a huge portion of our customer base, because we primarily focus on like, you know, financial services, healthcare, government, and so that's a huge one. The second is, it does feel to me like very fast startup is sort of explored right now, but it comes with a lot of trade-offs on like Docker in Docker support is basically like one of the things that you hit. Basically templates, and how do you choose to start up an instance? Do you want it to be basically prepared and ready to go to run a database inside of the sandbox and also 5 other services, and like how much memory and compute do you offload? Because like a customer who's running, well, I can maybe paint like a very concrete picture. Imagine one of your coding agents needs to run in a sandbox that has access to a service that itself takes like 60 gigs of RAM to run. It sort of has a branching dependency chain of a database that needs to be populated by a DB populator test service. And so spinning and orchestrating all of these things just to get your agent to run a test successfully is actually very difficult. And it means that the primitives that the sandbox providers have to build need to match everything from I vibe coded like a TypeScript like to-do app to, you know, the most complex infrastructure for dev testing in the world. And that'll probably get reduced over time as customers get more sophisticated. They segregate their dependencies, but not all enterprises have that, so it's hard.
Do you think that like the white space of working with sandboxes is going, I mean, this is maybe more of an, you know, sort of market competition question, but like, do you think the sandbox companies are going to be solving a lot of the orchestration, or do you think that's going to be self-built, or do you think new companies emerge and sort of operate at this like middleware layer?
Mm-hmm. And when you say orchestration, do you mean like
take snapshotting, for instance, like,
right.
You know, like you sort of were alluding to the idea of like, you know, is there a need for, like, I'll give you a dumb example. Is there a need for like a Git for sandboxes?
Yeah. I think that is in the ideal, available in like almost like with the sandbox provider. A year ago, when we first were testing a bunch of different sandbox providers, we ended up basically cycling through like almost all of them, because it felt like at any given moment there was like 2 or 3 things that the other one wasn't doing. And I think that actually is less of a like knock against the sandboxing companies, more against the speed of innovation. Like everyone knows that coding agents have evolved insanely quickly, but I think underappreciated is that so have sandboxes, and like just the raw capabilities of what's possible today. It has exploded in features and sort of what is expected out of the box. And that doesn't even get into the fact that today, like things like Claude Bot have shown us that a persistent computing experience might actually be preferable to an ephemeral one. And I think that also changes the story.
I want to switch gears, talk about enterprise and the journey that you've been on in making Factory work with the largest companies in the world. Can you talk about the challenges you faced and sort of what the journey has been there?
Yeah, I think that probably the underappreciated aspect of selling software development tooling to the enterprise is that just as much of what you sell is not a piece of software or product, but a mindset and a vision of the future and the change management aspect of transitioning to using these tools. And what I mean by that is it's very difficult to know what a priori until you see a tech example, what the implications of even 2 to 3 months of development in the space is, right? I think that people very much underestimated that IDEs would become far less relevant far quicker as agents moved into the terminal. However, IDEs are definitely still here. They're extremely valuable. The product architecture that is required to fit the terminal and the IDE and the cloud and the web is very different from the one that felt sort of the primary or the correct thing a year ago. And so I think navigating that is actually its own separate problem for a procurement team, for a VP of engineering. So we're trying to sort of add clarity and say, this is where we think we are. Let's try to give you as best of a peek into the future as possible. And then let's work together on basically a roadmap that takes you from here to there. And I think that people appreciate having that sort of partner mentality equally as much as they like having access to frontier AI software agents.
The chatter on Twitter is that the IDE is dead and agents are now CLIs or some type of orchestrator.
Right.
I mean, are the enterprises that you're talking to, are they bought in to that kind of thinking? I guess the question that I think there's a prejudicial idea of the enterprise is living a little bit in the past.
Yeah.
Is that your experience, or are they very much maybe not quite at the vanguard, but trailing even if only by a few months?
I think if anything, the enterprise is the most diverse segment in terms of technological capabilities and perspective on what correct is for their business. And what I mean by that is if you actually take a random sampling of YC startups, I guarantee you their stack looks far more similar than the enterprise. And maybe it just leans totally futuristic in that they're all using coding agents. But I think what we've seen is that there are certain enterprises, one of our larger customers is EY. I think that maybe in the year 2023, you wouldn't necessarily associate EY with the frontier of AI software development, but they have almost 10,000 software developers who live entirely by delegating tasks to coding agents. And they are way out of the IDE as the primary driver. They're using it on every language. They're modernizing legacy systems with our tooling. They are, in many ways, more advanced than some of the digital natives that we talk to about how they think through software development. And I think it's just the fact that they leaned in really early. Versus other companies we talk to want to make that jump, but they might have just recently procured an IDE-based product. They might still have a group or a segment that works in something like JetBrains remains a very popular IDE for Java, and if you're gonna do Java, you're gonna use JetBrains. And that's why our take is, there isn't a right or wrong here. The IDE is extremely valuable as a tool, and we think that you should use an IDE to do code, and it's why we're model or surface agnostic as well. We wanna support you in JetBrains, in Xcode, in Visual Studio, in Cursor, really any IDE you use, Droids can be there.
If you're serving the enterprise, there's obviously a diversity of deployment scenarios. Can you talk a little bit about how hard has it been to support on-prem?
Yeah, this is something that is such a scary word, I think, to startups, on-prem. And basically what everybody told us was, don't do that. They were like, on-prem is dying, don't do it, do not try and support that. And we basically said, let's just check if that's actually true. And it turns out, if you build knowing that your ICP might require things like full data governance, like air gap, et cetera, in the software development agent space, you end up actually building something that is more friendly to developers, because basically you have to just go fully local first, right? So our whole agent loop, everything that Droid has lives entirely on the device. It sends inferences to an LLM. I sometimes joke, you could run Droid in a submarine if you wanted to. And that's true, as long as the submarine had GPUs, right? And so on-prem actually sort of came out of the box with that product architecture. And then things like sandboxing is possible when you have like sandbox providers that support on-prem, and all the other nice to haves that let you then bring a full cloud agent experience as well.
I saw a blog post from you guys a few months ago that I found really exciting. Can you talk about signals?
Yeah. So for folks, signals is basically the system that we use to ingest information from all of the sources of bug feedback, customer triage information, ideas we have internally actually, like and analysis of interactions with our agent. So Droid basically goes and it agentically reads through hundreds or sometimes thousands of these signals of, hey, like this thing isn't working. I'm having trouble with the MCP server for Atlassian. It would be awesome if you guys had BYOK support for the new Minimax model. Like all these like little tidbits that you get from different customers, from different people. It aggregates all of them, builds out an understanding or a map and clusters basically the types of problems that people experience, positive, negative frictions, and then it actually pushes those into our project management system, assigns priorities, and then tags developers. And then we've started to close the loop where Droid will actually then automatically pick those tickets up, put up a PR, and then just tag the developer for review. And we're actually just at the point where our review experience now actually assigns basically a probability that this is mergeable without human review. And then though we still review no matter what, and because there's like SOC compliance things that ultimately force us to human review. But I think that generally it's more of a directional statement about I think where things are going, which is that there's certain types of changes that will be entirely end-to-end completed by AI systems. Today, the human being a part of that loop is extremely critical. In like 2 years, I could totally see a world where we sort of are like, actually, no, that's the sensitive part of the system. You're like not allowed to touch that as a human. That's only for like the AI systems to work on. And I think that that's like a real world that we're gonna be in like fairly near term.
So you've built this internally. Like, is your expectation that this is something that like eventually you productize for the rest of us?
Yeah, I think that there's this idea that's been floating around of like, I mean, we're called factory, right? And there's this idea of like the dark factory that's been growing in a lot of different spaces. And a dark factory is one where inside of this, like, it's like a concept in like physical factories, right? Where the lights are off because it's all robots. There's no need for, no humans are walking inside that factory. And I think that there is this sense that there's a world where today, probably like 90 to 95% of your software developers work directly on the product that they're building. They sort of like say, oh, I want to change this thing, I want to do that. And then maybe 5 or 10% of your like product team or your engineering team, they work on the product engineering system that builds your product, right? And you'd call these people dev platform, you'd call them product managers, you'd call them like dev enablement, DevX, et cetera. I think that the world we're moving towards is where increasingly almost like 100% of your team will work on building the product engineering system that builds your product. So they will modify the agents and the constitution that the agents have on how to prioritize. They will modify the review system so that it reviews more accurately. They will sort of build their factory. And I think that in that world, there's clearly, actually, maybe even more things for humans to be involved with because the debates are harder. It's not like there's an objective, like this architecture is better than that. It's all about prioritization. It's about almost like product-y sort of decisions. And so I think that there's like it's a very optimistic, in my mind, view of like what humans do because we basically start to design these like even more complex systems that produce the outputs.
Are you familiar with the Elonism?
Yeah, the machine that builds the machine.
Well, it's that, but he also, I think, says the factory is the product.
Yeah, the factory is the product. Yeah,
Which is well suited.
Our Twitter bio for the first like 6 months of the company's existence was the machine that builds the machine. And I think that that's sort of what we provide other folks is basically the building blocks for you to build the machine that builds your products.
We have so many I think the crazy thing about the coding agent landscape is we go through these paradigm transitions, and we don't just go through them every few years. It feels like we go through them now every 9 months or so.
Yeah.
What's next?
Yeah, I think that clearly the terminal interface is super popular. I think that there's a reason for that. It's simplicity, portability, et cetera. I do think that GUIs are going to come back in a way, like native apps, web experiences, remote, sandboxes make this really possible. So I think that there will be a bit of a return to the interface that happens very slowly. But the terminal is definitely here to stay for the near term as a very powerful primitive. I think that this dark factory idea is something that a lot of people are going to start building out themselves. You can actually start to see companies building this out. I sort of see Stripe and Ramp and all these other companies have these great blog posts about how they built their own bootstrapped cloud agents, software pipeline. I sort of see that very similar to companies in the aughts, 2010s, who are sort of posting about their self-managed clusters and their physical hardware. I think something like AWS just makes infinitely more sense for all businesses, and so it's the end state. But in the meantime, if you can't find someone who can give you the tooling to build your software factory, if you don't know about us, honestly, then I think that you are going to start building many pieces of this yourself, because the actual primitives, sandboxes, coding agents, model agnostic, so that you can use and route and basically be cost effective. I think those things are all available to many people today, and you just need to sort of assemble them together. And so I think that the future is an increasingly opinionated, basically, take on how to build your software factory.
What is the end state? I mean, is that it?
This is a conversation that we have a lot of I think end is probably I guess it depends on the time scale. I think that you can imagine a world where today, what does an engineering manager, or maybe even a director of engineering do, right? They set resource allocation, and they set KPIs, and they give high-level opinionated takes about architecture, and they help settle conflict and disagreement. Yeah, I know many are experimenting. Missions is an example of a multi-agent architecture. You can imagine teams, squads, pods of agents that sort of are told, hey, here's a high-level KPI, build me $1 billion SaaS, good luck, make it happen, right? I think that there's probably something more grounded with a proper interface and all this other stuff that helps you manage AI systems. And I think that what that means is that as an individual developer, when you're a part of these teams, you will be responsible for an increasingly broader amount of basically software. And you can expect that to lead to sort of a bimodal distribution of companies, where there are a couple companies that have really, really deep vertical software that's really good at something. And then you have very wide horizontal companies that hire a ton of developers to sort of each of them owning these pods of agents that work on one software product. And I think that will increase optionality generally of software. You can sort of get the cookie cutter, horizontal platform products, or you can maybe have crafts and get a super verticalized thing. Paul Graham has an article he just published a week ago about watches and what happened when the quartz movement became popular and watches basically became very easy to make. And I think that article is great at sort of getting at this dynamic of what happens when it's just really easy to make software.
This has been so much fun. Thank you for being with us today, and very excited for the future of Factory.
Yeah,
Thanks
amazing.
so much, man.
Thank you.